So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second in our February 2015 webinar series. We have with us this morning Dr. Kathy Vackel to share a presentation on radiation and health. So thank you so much, Dr. Vackel, and please go ahead.
Okay, well, thanks to Bernane for organizing this, and thanks for everyone for listening. So I'm going to talk about radiation and health. Generally, what is radioactivity, radiation, ionizing radiation, a little bit about uranium mining and nuclear power, what happens in a reactor, and of course the health effects, which is the main focus, and then a little bit about accidents, because that's all part of the whole picture, and just for completion, the medical radiation sources through scans and medical procedures. So, okay, so firstly, what is ionizing radiation? This is also called radioactivity. So if you remember your grade 12 chemistry, you've got your periodic table with all the elements. So each one of those has the atoms of each of these elements have a certain number of protons, which is a little particle with mass, and it's positively charged. There are an equal number of electrons, which are negatively charged, so that the atom is neutral. The electrons don't really have mass. And there are also neutrons, which don't have charge, and they also have mass. But some of the same kind of atom have different numbers of neutrons, so they actually have different little numbers beside them. The actual weight is different, and these are called isotopes. They're isotopes of the same kind of atom. Most of these are stable. Some are unstable, and we call these radioactive because they have the propensity to kind of shoot off little bits of themselves, subatomic particles. Different kinds of this kind of radiation. One is called alpha radiation, alpha emission, where it shoots off 2 protons and 2 neutrons. Sometimes they're just high energy, like rays and photons that don't have mass. But when an atom does this, it then becomes another atom, and that's called a decay product. And if that one then is radioactive, it shoots off its little particles, and it becomes something else, and it will keep going down what we call decay chain if each of these is radioactive until it reaches something that is not radioactive, which is stable. So these are all called decay products. The whole thing is called the decay chain. And when it shoots off these little particles, they give off a little bit of heat. So this chart, on the left there you see a list of different elements. The top is uranium-238. So this is the decay chain of uranium-238. Uranium-238 is an alpha emitter, which means it throws off 2 protons and 2 neutrons, and therefore it becomes thorium-234, and it's 4 numbers less than 238 because each of those 2 protons and 2 neutrons has a mass of 1. Thorium-234 is itself radioactive. It's a beta emitter and a gamma emitter. I'll explain this in a little bit. And that becomes protactinium, and so on, so on. Each of those down that chain is radioactive until it gets to that bottom lead-206, which is stable. Now, the horizontal black bars represent the half-lives. Now, half-life is how long it takes, say, uranium-238, if you've got a little pile of it, for half of it to go on to become thorium-234. And now the half-life of uranium-238 is very long. It's 4.5 billion years. Some of these are very short. If you go down the list, polonium-214 is 160 microseconds. But each of them have their own different half-life. It takes about 10 half-lives for the whole little pile of whatever it is to kind of basically disappear. So now uranium, there are basically three isotopes of uranium. There's 238, 235, and there's actually 234, but the vast majority of what's in rock is 238. Uranium mining is like any other mining. It's a big, huge pit that's dug. They extract the rock. In the case of uranium, they grind it up, and they try with different kinds of chemicals to extract the uranium, which is mostly 238 with a little bit of 235. And that's called yellow cake, and that gets taken off to be dealt with. What's left is a whole bunch of rock and ground-up rock. Still, most of the uranium is still in it because you can't extract all of it. It's not easy to extract it. And the difference between uranium mining and other kinds of mining, all the tailings, which is what's left, are always really toxic. But in the case of uranium, it's also radioactive. So what they do is they put it in a big pile, or they kind of dig another pit. They put water on it to keep the radon down, because back at that chart I just showed you, the radon is one of the decay chain products of uranium-238, and it's a gas, and it's a potent lung carcinogen. We know that it's the second most common cause of lung cancer after smoking. And it comes out of rock, the little traces of uranium in rock in our houses, so that's why there's a big campaign now for us to be measuring radon in our houses. Anyway, then because the radon is a gas, they need to put water on all of this, and so you get these tailings ponds. Of course, they cannot really contain everything, so everything leaches out into the soil, into the local water, and up into the air. So quite contaminated around any mine, in particular uranium mines. Now, the yellow cake then goes to Blind River, and by the way, most of the uranium in Canada comes from northern Saskatchewan, some from other places, a little bit in Ontario also. So it gets refined in Blind River, and what's going to be used in our CANDU reactors goes to Port Hope, where it's made into fuel bundles to use in our reactors. The rest will go to the U.S., where it's called enriched. And what that means is they like for their reactors the 235, and they use the fact that the 238 is a little bit of a bigger, heavier molecule, and they centrifuge so that the heavy stuff goes on the outside, and they put it through filters. So they basically extract out the 235. What's important about this is that what's left is this waste product of U-238. This is only in the States, by the way. So U-238 is very hard and dense, so they actually use it on the outside of bullets and the outside of tanks because it's protective. And they've used it, and these are called depleted uranium weapons. They've used it in the Gulf, in the Balkans, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan. It's a bit of a concern because on contact, it combusts, and it makes a very fine mist, which when you inhale it is so fine it will actually go into your lung tissue, into your circulation, and deposit in your tissues, and it goes through its decay chain. It's uranium-238, and it causes damage. So there's concern about soldiers coming back from these places with different illnesses, cancers, possibly lymphoma, and particularly for the people that live in these war-torn places, because they are living in these bullet casings and burnt-out tanks with uranium-238 dust in them. And nobody has studied this, but there is a lot of anecdotal stories about high rates of cancer, miscarriage, stillbirth, and quite bizarre birth defects in the people who live in these places. So uranium mining, the health effects, it's been known for decades, if not centuries, that uranium miners have higher rates of lung cancer, and this is due to the radon, because when they're down there hacking apart the rock, the radon is released, because, again, it's on that decay chain of uranium-238, so there's going to be some radon, and it's a lung carcinogen. They also have silicosis, which is the silica that's in the rock, and uranium itself is a kidney toxin. So there's often been a lot of concern about the health and safety of uranium miners, and in 1976 they actually went on strike in Elliott Lake, and that prompted the Ham Commission in 1976, which then developed, it was a royal commission, and it developed a set of guidelines for mining and safety of miners. The whole process of mining is always very polluting, and again, particularly for uranium mining, the pollutant is radioactive. I'm just going to briefly speak to this, that pretty well worldwide for mining, and including uranium mining, it becomes an issue of Aboriginal rights and land rights, because, of course, the dirty work of mining often ends up being on Aboriginal land. So this is just a picture of tailings ponds. I believe this is Elliott Lake. So you can see it's a big, huge pond full of toxic water, basically. Some areas have done a very good job of kind of removing as much of the toxic stuff they can, and they kind of what they call remediate, and they put earth and plant grass, and it actually looks very nice afterwards. It's still a question of what do you do with all that radioactive tailings, which is the whole issue with nuclear waste. So inside a nuclear reactor, what happens? Well, when in our reactors, the bundles are made, well, the uranium is put in a form that can go in a fuel bundle. Interestingly, recently this has been discovered to be done, or they make the pellets, I believe, in right downtown Toronto near Lansdowne, like right in downtown. And nobody knew there was a uranium facility right in the middle of this neighborhood. And then it gets taken in these pellet form, I believe up to Peterborough, where they make it into fuel bundles, and then it gets taken back down to Pickering, Darlington, and then over to Bruce to be used in the reactors. So you've got these fuel bundles, which are about, I don't know, a couple of feet long, and so they contain uranium. So what they do is they bombard it with neutrons. This is inside the reactor. This causes these uranium atoms to split, which releases more neutrons, and this is called nuclear fission, which is a self-sustaining process, and it can't be stopped. So if this happens completely in an uncontrolled manner, it creates massive amount of heat and a massive blast, which is basically what happens with a nuclear bomb. But in a reactor, it's controlled. So you have these neutron-absorbing materials, moderating materials, and coolant, which is water. In our case, is heavy water for the CANDU reactors that goes over the whole area constantly to keep the cooling, to cool it, to control that amount of heat, which then boils water, which creates steam, which turns turbines, which makes electricity. So these fuel rods, basically, I mentioned alpha emission. So the form that they're in is an alpha emitter, which means it's a couple of protons, a couple of neutrons that get thrown off those little atoms of uranium. Now they're bulky and they don't go very far. They release a little bit of heat and with a little bit of force, but they can't penetrate your skin. So you can actually hold a fuel rod without getting hurt. But when they come out the other end, they're spent fuel, and they contain all sorts of fission products and bits of uranium, all very radioactive and very toxic, and they're gamma emitters, which is basically kind of like an X-ray, where it's not a particle, it's kind of like a ray. So that will penetrate through your skin and damage all the tissue on the way in there. So it also, in the spent fuel, is 200 brand new human-made products. One of them is plutonium. So plutonium can be used as a reactor fuel in other types of reactors, and in other places, I believe the UK and some places in Europe, they call it recycling the spent fuel. They aren't recycling it, they're just extracting. It's a very dirty process. They extract the plutonium out of it to use as reactor fuel. But plutonium is also what's used in the nuclear bomb. So this is the link between the nuclear energy industry and nuclear weapons. And this is why places like Iran, a lot of countries are concerned about a place like Iran, which they consider a bit of a rogue state, having the capacity to have nuclear energy because that gives them the capacity to have a nuclear bomb. In any case, you've got all these spent fuel rods, which are still extremely hot. They're put in these big, look like big swimming pools, and having cold water put around them constantly for 7 to 10 years until they're cool enough to actually handle, and then they put them in dry storage, which is these big sort of concrete silos on the site of the reactors, because basically nobody worldwide has ever figured out what to do with nuclear waste. There's about 40,000 tons of it and counting as we speak. As we continue to use nuclear energy, the amount continues to increase. So when those, say for alpha emission, when those little protons and neutrons are shot off, they do so not very far, but with great speed, and they will damage tissue around them. So if you have that a particle of one of those alpha emitters in your tissue, it will send out those little particles, and it will damage the local tissue. If it happens to be lodged inside a cell or inside a nucleus of a cell, it will damage your DNA. But anyway, so there's gamma radiation, which is penetrating. As I said, it's kind of like an X-ray. The thing about it is when you stop it, like with an X-ray machine, the damage stops. Then there's alpha and beta. These are non-penetrating, and they're called internal emitters because when you ingest them and or inhale them, they go inside you, into your tissues, and they sit there, and they go down that decay chain. And you can't speed it up, and you can't reverse it, and it has to be continuous. So once it's in there, and it's not reversible. So polonium, U-238, and radon, which are all on that chain of uranium-238, they're all alpha emitters. strontium, cesium, and iodine are beta emitters. That's smaller particles, but nevertheless they're internal emitters, and they sit in your tissue until they've gone all the way down their decay chain. In fact, they don't really disappear until for at least 10 half-lives. So this is a picture of a lung tissue of, I believe it's a monkey. In the middle, that black thing is a particle of plutonium, and you can see some lines coming out like a star, a wagon wheel. Those are the trajectories of the alpha particles that are sent out. And you can see how it will damage all the cells close by, or certainly cause the damage inside a cell. So the health effects are based on that. So when acute exposures of any toxin are actually pretty easy to look at and understand and study, because they happen right away, and it's very dramatic what happens to somebody. So acute radiation sickness is actually pretty easy to spot and pretty easy to study. It's the low-level constant emissions that we are all exposed to that are really hard to pinpoint and study. And as I said, the alpha emitters, the internal emitters, cause DNA damage, as do the gamma emitters, but at least they can stop once the ray stops. But anyway, DNA damage, we know, causes cancer, and it causes birth defects, miscarriage, stillbirth, reduced fertility. We know it causes immune problems and diabetes and heart disease, and if it occurs in the egg or sperm, it will cause inheritable disease, which goes on to the next generation. So the most susceptible cells are the fast reproducing cells, like in your bone marrow and your egg and sperm, fetal and embryonic tissue, the GI tract, and then growing bones and cartilage, so children, in other words. Some cancers are more radiosensitive than others, like thyroid cancer and leukemia. Children are more at risk because they are growing. It's not totally understand why women are more vulnerable. It may just be that the kind of cancers that they tend to be more radiosensitive type of cancers. But anyway, for these internal emitters, you have to remember that the whole process of the radioactive process is continuous and irreversible. So we're all exposed to background radiation, equivalent to averaged out about 2.4 millisieverts per year. Millisievert is just a way to measure radiation. Most of this is gamma radiation from the sun, and a lot of it is radon from rock in the ground. But we're constantly adding to this with the low-level emissions that are constantly coming off nuclear reactors and nuclear facilities. From the above-ground nuclear testing of the 50s and 60s, put a lot into the atmosphere, and then the accidents, large and small, all contribute to background radiation. The other big one for any individual is the medical procedures, which I'll mention at the end. So what are the allowable levels? Well, way back when, it was as much that would turn your skin red, which is a huge dose. And as we have understood radiation more and more over the years, we've reduced the acceptable, allowable level. Right now it's 1 millisievert per year. Interestingly, we don't seem to value our nuclear workers because their limit is 100 over 5 years with a maximum of 50 in any 1 year. And this translates to about 3 cases of cancer, fatal cancer, per 100 workers over a 40-year career, which is far higher than what's considered acceptable for an occupational hazard, which is 1 in 10,000 or 1 in a million fatalities. So you have to remember the damage is cumulative over the lifetime, over your lifetime. And the real question here is what is an acceptable risk? And this is true for any industry because nothing is without risk. So what we supposedly have done is look at the risks and then deemed this a safe industry. The problem is that my feeling is certainly in Ontario, the Ontario government and also the Canadian government have seemed to have convinced the public that the nuclear industry is clean and green. So I don't think people have the information that they should in order to make a decision about whether they accept this industry and its risks. What you have is basically studies, and they all have limitations, and they all use certain stats and formulas. And unless you have a basic, even more than a basic understanding of epidemiology, it's very hard to look at these studies and try and understand whether you trust them or not. The linear no threshold model is basically what's accepted pretty well worldwide by scientists, which is saying that there is no safe amount of radiation. All radiation is damaging. Unlike some things where there's a certain threshold under which it's safe and then over which it becomes harmful, it's not like that with radiation. The industry goes by the ALARA principle, which is as low as reasonably achievable or attainable, which means you try and keep the exposures as low as you can. The CNSC is the Canadian group agency that's responsible for the nuclear industry, and it's very clear to anybody that's had any dealings with them that they're very pro-industry. So one of the studies that people quote all the time is called the Lifespan Study of Hiroshima. So they looked at 120,000 people after the Hiroshima bombing and looked at them right up until almost the year 2000 and looked at their illnesses. And this is what they found. And it was to be expected. Higher rates of cancer, increase with dose, all these other illnesses. Interestingly, the survivors' children don't seem to have had any increase in birth defects. It's also the cancer that they found, it was increased, but it wasn't increased anywhere near as much as they expected. And these are kind of surprising findings. However, when you look at the study, there are some problems. The first is it's questionable the control group that they used, and the study group was not a random group, the 120,000 people, and the information was somewhat selective as far as I can see. But the biggest problem is the first 5 years are missing. So all the people that died aren't counted in this. So the people you're looking at are the healthier cohort who may have been either generally healthier, they may have been protected a bit because they were behind a wall or something and had less exposure, or they may just be more radio resistant generally. You have to remember too, this is a one-time massive blast of gamma radiation, which is not really comparable to what we all are exposed to, which is low-level chronic. However, today's safe levels are derived from this study. So let's look at a few studies. First going back to the 60s, Ursula Franklin, famous Canadian engineer, looked at strontium-90 levels in the teeth of children who were exposed to the above-ground weapons testing in the U.S., and she found the children who had more strontium in their teeth, strontium-90, had higher rates of childhood leukemia. And it was her work, actually, that prompted the U.S. to stop above-ground weapons testing in the 60s. But this study, this idea has continued on in the Tooth Fairy Project, which is up in the northeast of the U.S., where people send in their children's teeth, and they measure levels of these different radionuclides from the weapons testing or accidents or whatever, and they look at rates of illness. It's very interesting stuff. So in the UK, they have done a whole bunch of studies on, they're called the COMAIR studies, which is Commission on Medical Aspects of Radiation in the Environment. Because in the 80s, there were people who were worried that there were a lot of children living near nuclear facilities who were getting leukemia. So they prompted a bunch of these studies, which, again, it's very hard to study rare illnesses in small populations. Most reactors worldwide are in rural areas or tiny places, unlike Canada, where we put our reactors in the most populated part of the whole country. But anyway, so they did find some concerning findings. A lot of them were not statistically significant because the numbers are so small. And they're about at their, 16th, 17th report now in the UK from the COMAIR studies. And there were a number of other studies done in Europe, and some of them were negative, and some of them did show elevations, but they weren't significant. So it's very hard to tell. But this study, the KICK study, came out of Germany in 2008, and it's a better methodology. It's a better study type. Much more robust, and they looked at leukemia risk of children living near all 16 of their nuclear reactors. It was a case control study, and they found that children under 5 living within 5 kilometers had an increased risk of developing leukemia. Now, the German government still says that there is no explanation for this because they feel that the amount that's coming out of reactors, these low-level emissions, are far too low to explain it, and this finding remains unexplained. But similar study was done in France in 2012. They did the same thing, and they found that children under 15 living within 5 kilometers of every single one of their nuclear facilities, statistically significant, had an increased risk of leukemia. I think it was about double risk. But they also did these dose estimates and found that they were not related to the kids with the risk of getting leukemia. So they said it's nothing to do with the radioactivity coming out of these reactors. So what have we done in Canada? Very few studies, really, considering we have these reactors in a very populated area. In 2007, we did radiation and health in Durham, which is near where the Pickering-Darlington is. So it's an ecological study, which is not a robust methodology. They looked at many different kinds of cancers in these areas, and they did find an increase in leukemia and thyroid cancer, which is very concerning because they're both known to be radiosensitive, and other elevations of cancer and a little bit higher Down syndrome. But they claim that there are no patterns to it, so it's really nothing to do with the reactors. So everybody should be safe. Then they came out with another study in 2013, and this is the radiation exposure and cancer incidence around nuclear power plants. They looked at the cancer rates around 25 kilometers from the nuclear facilities. They also looked at doses, and these are estimates, and that's important to remember. And they concluded that the doses are very low, and there's no increase in cancer in this population due to radiation. However, when you look at the study, of course, the radius is 25 kilometers. The concerning studies in Germany and France were 5 kilometers. So this is too large a radius to be able to see anything. And also, when they look at these doses, they'll take a few doses near the reactor. They look at wind patterns. They look at rain patterns. They look at weather. They use these models of the hypothetical man, woman, and child, and how much they eat and how much they expect of tritium or whatever radiation might be on what they eat. All these modeling assumptions, they plug it into a computer with all these formulas, and they come up with a dose. But you have to remember, these are not real doses in real people. They're hypothetical doses in hypothetical people, and I really question how valid they are. And again, these are generally rare illnesses. These are generally small populations, so it's very hard to show increases. However, they did show an increase in thyroid cancer and leukemia, which they basically dismissed, and that's very concerning. There's also a study done here in 2013 estimating cancer risk in relation to tritium from routine operation of Pickering. So tritium is radioactive hydrogen, and it's important because our CANDU reactors produce a lot of tritium. And they put tritium out as a little bit of in their regular emissions constantly. And it's important because hydrogen, we are largely hydrogen. It incorporates into water molecules and the carbon chain molecules, which largely make up our bodies. So this study looked at different cancers in people living near Pickering, basically. And they also did these estimates of tritium doses, and they concluded there's no increased risk of cancer due to tritium. However, when you look at the tritium study, they actually found double risk in young girls. And they just basically dismissed this and said it's not real, it can't be due to the tritium. And again, the doses are total estimates. They're not real measurements in real people. And importantly, they didn't include children under 5, who were the ones found to be at risk in these European studies. There's also a question of the control group and whether it was a fair control group. So again, lots of problems with this study. So in conclusion, in Canada, mostly we have ecological studies, small numbers, and lots of limitations. There are some findings that are very concerning. We've never had a large case control study, and yet we do have quite robust European studies that show concerning findings. Children particularly living within 5 kilometers of reactors. So just a quick word about nuclear waste, which most people on the phones know a lot about. So Nuclear Waste Management Organization in Canada is responsible for this. So right now we have about 2 million spent fuel bundles. They each weigh 24 kilos. Like I said, it's equivalent to well over 40,000 tons right now, and it's just sitting there on the reactor sites waiting for us to figure out what to do with them. They have to be cooled for 7 to 10 years before they can even be handled and put in those concrete silos. So the question is, do you just store them somewhere? And that's, if you keep on producing it, you're just going to keep on having to store it. Or do you bury it deep under the Canadian Shield, which is the big controversy now? Of course, that's very expensive. Nobody has ever done this before. it's completely unprecedented. We have no idea how the rock would react. You've already disturbed it because you've made a hole in it to put this stuff down there. Big concerns about leaking into the air and, of course, into the water, because if it's near a water source like Lake Huron, the Great Lakes, you're talking about the water source for millions and millions and millions of people, not to mention all the wildlife. Issues with transporting this stuff, too. And just a word about weapons proliferation. So there's concern about spent fuel with the plutonium and tritium that can be isolated and made into bombs. They can be stolen by people wanting to make bombs. You can just run a plane into the reactors and maybe make it explode, who knows. And just a word about nuclear war. I'm not going to say any more, except there is no meaningful medical response. And I've also mentioned about depleted uranium, which is part of the weapons proliferation. So just a word about accidents. An accident anywhere is an accident everywhere, and this particularly pertains to nuclear accidents. So Fukushima, we're almost at 4 years now. There were 6 reactors. There was a big earthquake, tsunami, a big flood, knocked out the electricity, so the coolant stopped working. So there was a huge meltdown and explosions. Luckily, a lot of the radioactivity, the waste, the emissions, whatever, went out into the ocean and continue to. But the big explosion, of course, made this massive air plume, which went east, luckily, and did not go west towards Tokyo. But anyway, it made its way around the world within a few days, and it was measurable worldwide. So what is going on now in Fukushima? You don't hear about this. This is in some ways, a lot of people say this is worse than Chernobyl, which at least just happened and then it stopped. This is ongoing. Right now, there is melted fuel in the containment structures of those 3 reactors, and they are constantly having to keep it cool, because if it gets hot, it will explode again, and then you'll get another massive air plume. So they're constantly putting this water all over it to cool it, but it comes out, of course, completely radioactive, the water. So what do you do with that? Then there are all these tanks that they've made, and they just keep putting 300 tons a day into these tanks, so they just have to keep building more tanks. And there's also the groundwater that runs through there every day, and it goes directly into the ocean. The storage tanks are leaking. There's all sorts of concerns about safety, because they can't even go in there because it's so hot. They don't even really know what's going on in there. And there's, just suffice it to say, there's been a massive lack of transparency by Tokyo Electric Power Company right from the beginning as to what's really been going on there. So, health-wise, they claim that everybody's healthy and there's no increase in thyroid cancer or leukemia, but everything's being suppressed. Lots of anecdotes of people talking about birth defects, and Downs, etc. Thyroid cancer in children, but that's been denied. Now the UN, can't remember exactly, Commission on, can't remember what it stands for. Anyway, it's the UN branch that studies radiation and health. They came up with a report last year that said there were no health effects, but you have to remember the UN agreed or the WHO basically agreed in 1959 to not basically publicize any talk about or any studies about radiation and health at the request of the IAEA, which is the International Atomic Energy Association, of course, very pro-nuclear organization. Chernobyl, again, 1986, the worst accident in history, a level 7, although not very long after it happened, Fukushima was designated level 7 also. Contamination worldwide, huge number of people were evacuated. As to the deaths and studying the health, nobody has really done that. I guess this was 1994. It was estimated that 31 people died, and they were all nuclear workers. UNSCEAR, again, the United Nations, here it is, Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, said maybe 64. And then the IAEA themselves said it could have reached 4,000. In 2005, they said that. And then Greenpeace did a study, and they estimated up to 200,000 excess cancer deaths, and that's just cancer from Chernobyl. And then this man, Alexei Yablokov, he started Greenpeace in Russia, and he did a big analysis of a lot of studies, a lot of them that had been ignored in Eastern Europe because they weren't peer-reviewed, etc. And he came up with a number, 985,000 premature deaths. Nobody knows a lot of the studies. There's a lot of controversy around this, but just to keep in mind what people are saying, that just a handful of people died, is probably not true, and it's probably not true with Fukushima either. Nuclear power is safe only if no act of God is permitted, just to say that accidents happen. So just a quick word about medical exposures. So this is through medical isotopes. These are the trackers that you get injected, and then they take pictures to see where it goes. Through X-rays, and particularly CT scans, are a high dose of radiation. And again, it's cumulative. Women and children are more vulnerable. And remember, the allowable is 1 millisievert per year of all sources extra. About half of radiation exposure of that to Americans is from medical procedures, particularly CT scans. Alice Stewart was I think she was a doctor in the 50s. I think she was in the 50s, yeah, and she was concerned about people X-raying pregnant women, and she did a study which showed that those children whose mothers were X-rayed while pregnant had double the risk of leukemia by the time they were 10. She was poo-pooed at the time, and it took until the 70s that we stopped X-raying pregnant women. I can't remember what beer stands for, but anyway, it's a group that studies ionizing radiation, biological effects of ionizing radiation in the States. They say that 1 in 1,000 people receiving a 10 millisievert dose will develop cancer. And you'll see when I'll show you the list of how much. There's a lot of CT scans that give you 10 millisieverts per year per scan. 1 in 500 women, 1 in 660 men will develop cancer if they've had a CT of the abdomen by the time they're 20, and 1 in 550 children, 1 in 1,500 children who have a CT of the head will develop cancer. So these are just X-rays, basically. As you can see, they're not very many millisieverts. You can have 1.0, so it's just a fraction of these for the extremity X-rays, dental X-rays. Mammogram is almost half of your yearly allowance. Chest X-rays a little bit more, skull and pelvic. Pelvic's getting up there, abdominal, hip, and then lumbosacral spine, which a lot of people get for low back pain, is 1.5 millisieverts. But the real culprit is CT scans. As you can see, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 15 sometimes some of these CT scans, 15 times your yearly allowance. And then medical isotopes. This is these trackers that they inject radioactive stuff into your blood. Still, well more than 1.0 that's allowable. But you have to remember, it's all cost benefit. So if you want, as the bottom one, coronary stent, that's going to save your life. So that may well be worth the risk. But I do think the medical community is a bit cavalier about ordering these, and they have to keep it in mind. The risk associated with the test. So in summary of the health effects, uranium mining and the refining, emissions from these reactors, these are these low-level emissions that are constantly coming out of the reactors. That's very hard to study the health effects in local people. And nuclear waste, of course, massive problem, health issue, and ethical issue. I think that to land future generations with all of this stuff is just totally immoral. The risk of accident is real. We have one major accident worldwide every 10 years, and particularly a problem here because we have such a large population near our reactors and downwind and downstream. Weapons proliferation, nuclear war, I don't really have to say any more about that, and then medical procedures. So I think that's my last slide.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Kathy. That was very helpful. I'm going to stop the recording now, and then we'll go to question and answer. Attempting to stop the recording. I think we'll proceed to question and answer simply because the recording button wants to persist. So a couple of reminders about how we use the system now through the question and answer. So there is up in the top of your screen, there's a mood button, and you can click that on that mood button, and you'll see a list of options, including raise hand. And if people could raise hands when they want to ask a question, that'll help us just avoid speaking over each other. You can also ask questions using the chat function. So down in your bottom left-hand corner, you'll see the chat button. It should show send to everyone and type your message here in your very bottom left. And if you go into that area and you can key in a message, type here, and it appears. And so you can ask questions there for particularly those who are connected through computer and don't have their phones and don't have their microphone active. And questions, maybe I'll leave that up as just as a reminder to people of how to use some of those functions. So do we have questions or comments for Dr. Vakel? We've got 25 on the line, so I'm going to scope up and down to see our hands being raised. I see that most of the callers have their phone open. So,
hello.
Go ahead.
I'd just like to say hello.
Hi, is
hello.
that Candace?
Yeah.
Speakers could identify themselves, please.
Okay. I'd just like to say to Dr. Vakel that I really appreciate the effort and hard work she's put into raising awareness on the health issues and radiation. Being from an area where uranium mining is causing a lot